Hi, I'm Barbara Call, Senior Director of Content Operations and Strategy at IDG, and I'd like to welcome you to today's on-demand webcast. Today we'll be talking about a case study that illustrates how to leverage technology and process to automate record categorization and data classification. Joining me today is Jake Frazier. Jake is a Senior Managing Director at FTI Consulting and heads the Information Governance, Privacy, and Security practice within the technology segment. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you.
Also joining me today is Anthony Diana, co-chair of Reed Smith's IP, Tech, and Data Group. Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you, Barbara. Happy to be here.
Great. So before we get started, I'd like to say a few words about our sponsors. The CGOC, Compliance, Governance, and Oversight Council, is a forum of over 3,800 legal, privacy, and security and RIM professionals. Established in 2004, its charter is to create a forum in which executives can get the insight, interaction, and information they need to make good business decisions. IBM Analytics enables anyone to engage with data to answer the toughest business questions, uncover patterns, and pursue breakthrough ideas. As part of a cognitive strategy, organizations can transform their industry and professions with data. Empower teams across the enterprise, including legal, compliance, records, and security, to find and manage critical data where it resides, whether on-premises or in the cloud. Now I'll hand things over to Jake so we can get started.
Great. Thanks very much, Barbara. We're excited to talk to you today about a really exciting topic and how we leverage technology to classify amounts of information that really human beings wouldn't be able to classify, even if we had a big room full of human beings for a long time. So we've broken this out into two different parts. One, the future is now, managing messaging data. Anthony and I will talk a little bit about what's possible out there and how the landscape is shifting. And we'll quickly dive into a case study so that we can kind of show how this is actually happening out there and some best practices and maybe some pitfalls to avoid in using analytic software and large amounts of unstructured data. So Anthony, I'd say that the future is now. This is something that, many years we've seen lots of PowerPoint presentations that have a great promise but haven't really delivered with actual tangible results. What are you seeing in the marketplace and with your clients, Reed Smith's clients, with regard to using this powerful technology?
Yeah, Jake, I think, as you know, I think in the e-discovery world, we've been using technology and advanced analytics to help with e-discovery and finding key documents and categorizing documents like privileged documents using data analytics, predictive coding, whatever you want to call it. I think the big challenge has been, as we try to use that same technology in the enterprise to categorize records or find other risk-based documents, is that it hasn't been indexed. And it's hard to, when you have a file share or something, not having an index means that you really can't use the advanced analytics. I think what we've seen over the past 2 to 3 years in particular, but I think we're definitely going to see an acceleration of that, is that basically the technology platforms that index large quantities of data in the enterprise sort of actively. So as you're using it, it's actually being indexed. We're seeing that. We've seen it for IBM Stored IQ. We see it for Microsoft Office 365. And I think both of those tools and other tools are providing an opportunity where you have all of your information indexed. And once it's indexed, we can start using analytics to actually do some really exciting things, including record categorization.
And one of the things, just to kind of piggyback on that type of technology as we move into the case study, this client had a problem that's all too common, I think, with most any large or mid-sized organization, really, in that they had an email archive that had been grown over many years. And when they finally got the process and the people piece of the equation ready to categorize legal holds, to understand regulatory retention requirements, the email archive really just wasn't capable of providing that level of granularity. It was sort of unteachable, if you will. So as we dive into this case study, we'll talk a little bit about how we had to move the client's information into a governance-aware type repository that had all the indexing and analytics capability that Anthony just mentioned, and then how we can kind of move through the process to actually get classification done where you can separate wheat from chaff in that archive in order to enable such things as defensible disposal, early case assessment, and all sorts of other benefits. But Anthony, maybe if we start with the case study, really the goal and kind of the problem, was that description pretty good, or did you notice any other issues that they had as far as headwinds to tackle this?
Yeah, look, I think one of the things that we have to think about stepping back if you're going to start a project like this, Jake, I think one of the things you mentioned is you have to figure out what technology you're going to use. And as often is the case, as in this case, was that legacy technology just wasn't capable of doing what they wanted to do. But I also want to make sure that we highlighted the fact about people and process. There is no quick fix. There is no magic button here in terms of technology. You need to have people and process. As we go through this, you'll hear how much people were involved, the resources needed to do this, as well as a process that was defensible, was critical to leveraging the technology to do what we needed to do. And again, I think one of the things I think people have to keep in mind, I think people get a little confused when they talk about record categorization and like, it is very much a defensive process and a risk-based approach, not a sort of document-by-document view of is this a record or is it not. I think one of the challenges that we've seen in the past is I think a misinterpretation of what not only technology does, but really what the process of identifying records is really geared for. In the end, it's a business process, right? And like every business process, there's some risk involved with it. And part of it is understanding what the risks are as you approach a project like this, taking steps to mitigate those risks, and then, frankly, accepting the risks. It's never going to be perfect. You're never going to get 100%. So I think the thing to keep in mind is what is your goal here? And your goal is really to get a much better view on your data, what the data is, and then be able to make decisions based on the information that you have. And I think that's critical in terms of thinking about this. Is one of the things I like to say is there's no such thing as a records manager. It's a risk manager. All records managers are really managing risk associated with records and the legal and regulatory requirements around that. And I think that's critical when you start thinking about a project like this and engaging in a project like this.
Absolutely. So if we look into really kind of fast forward to the solution here and some of the outcomes that this client was able to achieve, maybe I'll start with a couple, but if you could chime in, one of the problems was email exists all over the network. It's very typical. Usually it takes 10, 15 years of email practices to get here, but you have email in disparate locations. There's often PST files that are on file shares, email messages standalone on desktops, PSTs on desktops, email on SharePoint, backup tapes full of Exchange backups or Lotus Notes backups, PSTs, and so forth. So one of the very first things that had to happen was a centralization process of migration. The problem being, if you're going to classify email in a repository, but you don't classify those corresponding copies out there, then if you take action on the classified email, but you don't take action on those copies that are out there that are the same message, you haven't really actually solved the problem. You've sort of moved the problem. So migrating and eliminating PSTs were a critical issue. But I know there was also some policy work for this particular client. Can you maybe walk us through how they evolved their policy?
Sure. So, and again, I think what we're highlighting here is you can't just jump into this. I've seen a number of clients sort of rush ahead and they look at an email archive or a big data lake of information that's been collected and they want to immediately start doing things because they want to make progress. And one of the things that we talk about is let's start with a policy. You always want to start with a policy and procedures because you can't really do anything effectively without that. And I think, Jake, as you mentioned, one of the things that we've worked with clients on is from a high-level perspective, and this includes senior management, there has to be a policy about how you're dealing with messaging data, and it has to be consistent and like. So as you said, one of the things you have to do if you really want to manage email, for example, in an email archive that has all this fancy technology, is you have to put some restrictions on the business. And that includes creating PSTs and relying on PSTs. So the whole purpose of record categorization in part is developing a system where people have access to records and they're classifying them that way for business use as well as for legal and regulatory. As you mentioned, if you allow end runs around that, and senior executives are the ones who usually like the end runs, it undermines the program. So part of it, and one of the reasons why it's good to start with policy, is it gets all the stakeholders in place and making key decisions. that everyone has sort of staked their claim to. So the businesses, legal, compliance, IT, everyone has to sit in a room and say, okay, what is our goal here, and what is the policy around that, and what are the procedures we're going to have and processes around that. So I think that was one of the critical factors as you start moving forward is getting the buy-in on the policy so everyone understands what is the vision. And it's not easy. You're always going to get pushback, oftentimes from the business. But unless you have a policy in place, you really can't accomplish what you want to accomplish.
Understood. And, as we kind of move into the next part of the case study where the auto classification tool was leveraged to, in essence, at lightning speed, be able to read an email, determine, this is an email about contracts or finance or whatever. I'm curious, maybe if you can tell us a little bit about that classification, but also oftentimes we'll hear folks that say, look, this technology might be completely sound, but if I'm trying to explain to a judge one day why I don't have evidence, how can I build that defensibility? And I'm just curious kind of what you think the role of outside counsel is in using this kind of powerful technology.
Sure. So one of the things in this case study that was, and probably the critical decision, was the concept that all email was only going to be kept for 6 months, right? So that was the policy. And I was asked as outside counsel, is that defensible? And the reality is there's no legal obligation to keep email. There is no obligation unless you're a broker-dealer or something like that. Generally, email is just a form. It's not the substance that's being regulated. So in this case, the first big step was, besides saying there's no PSTs outside, everything has to be in this one place where it can be actively managed. The other key decision from a policy perspective was no email it could be around longer than 6 months. And then what the plan was to have processes in place to make sure from a legal hold perspective, if an email was subject to legal hold, that was kept. And we designed a process around that was defensible. And as outside counsel, that was one of the things that I was asked by this client, is to make sure that whatever process they had for legal holds was defensible. And then the second part was record categorization. And the idea being that there were several processes, which we'll get into in terms of leveraging technology, to make sure that any record, both on a going forward basis, was accurately categorized as a record, because this company, as a highly regulated healthcare company, did have regulatory obligations around records that it needed to keep for a certain amount of time. So we developed a process both on the front end and on the back end to get the defensibility around the whole process, which would have allowed the general counsel and the head of compliance and everyone else with a stake in this to bless this entire process and say, okay, now I understand what's going on here. Here's the steps that we took, what the documentation was around it in terms of making it defensible, so they can sign off. And again, if anybody ever questioned it, whether it was a regulator or a court, we would have the documentation ready and, frankly, the authorization by legal, compliance, and others that this was a sound process. And again, I think it's hard for a regulator or a court to question a good process. They could always question the results, and that's always going to be the case. But it's harder to question a process that's been very developed and documented.
Great. And, kind of curious, there was always the question of, do we rely on technology or do we rely on humans? And I know in most cases, like in e-discovery for technology-assisted review, the answer is really both, right? But you want to leverage the humans. In this case study, I know that the client also deployed some employee tagging tools. Just curious how that fit into the overarching approach here.
Yeah, so one of the things that we realized, and again, I think this goes what we were talking about before, that you don't want to, technology is not a magic bullet. It's people, process, and technology. And the people can be experts, which we talked about, and we'll be talking about the expertise needed to classify and to train the tool to classify the records. But also, you want the business folks, the people who are on the ground, to have some role and some ownership, frankly, in terms of managing records. I mean, this was an organization, like many organizations, that I think employees were not really asked to do much in terms of records. It was sort of a stale, stagnant program at this point, and they wanted to change the culture. They wanted to change the culture that people had to manage their data and frankly had to identify records. So one of the things that we decided as part of this program was to have a tool to help them. So when an email comes in or they send an email, the employee was asked to tag something as a record. And I think one of the challenges is does everybody remember the record retention schedule? Who's going to memorize this? So there was a tool that was developed that would actually give them hints. In essence, it was a tool that when they saw the message and they wanted to know, well, what should I categorize this with? On the side, it would say, here's 5 potential options for you to think about. And this was the tool was trained already, so it would just basically is an aid to help people categorize things as records. And one of the things to keep in mind, I think people worry about, oh my God, if I had to classify every email, that'd be half my job. Less than 5% of your emails are going to be records. So if you think about it that way, if you're getting 100 emails, it's only 5 a day. And again, you're classifying it, the people receiving it are classifying it. So it's not a huge burden, and the tool was really there to help as an aid to help the employees start tagging records and, frankly, understanding their business better.
Great. And, I'm curious, as you talk about these classes, a class that might say something like, okay, this is a tax record, right, or this is a contract. A lot of companies have retention policies that may have hundreds and hundreds of these classes. It starts to get pretty daunting, and that's when people start to, I think, get a little discouraged that it might be too complex to implement. But I'm curious from an outside counsel standpoint how it looks like you've done some sort of risk ranking here and how that might play in order to tell your client, look, these, 5 or 7 or whatever classes are the ones to really put a lot of extra weight behind because we know that, they are critical to you keeping your license or something like that. How does that process work?
Sure. So one of the things that we decided early on was, there's 140 record types here, and that was a lot of work to train each of them. So one of the things that we looked at, and this is particularly true for the historical audit classification we're going to do, is let's focus our resources on what we think is the high risk, right? So it's a risk-based approach, and this goes to my point of we're risk managers here, not records managers. What we were trying to do is identify what is the risk associated with the emails that are coming in, which ones are records, and how do we do this? So one of the first steps we took is we looked at the entire retention schedule, and one of the first cuts we did was how many of these record types are actually subject to legal or regulatory requirements. So if you look at any record retention schedule, a lot of it is based on business, right? The business needs a record. They've come up with a certain amount of time they think they should have that record for. That is, from a risk perspective, wildly different from a legal and regulatory requirement that they have to keep certain records a certain amount of time. So one of the first things we did is we looked at the record retention schedule and determined what are the laws that underlie some of these retention schedules. And so we looked at it and determined that there was probably, less than half actually had a regulatory or a legal requirement. So we focused on those records. And then the next step we took was, and this I think is critical in sort of thinking about managing any data source, but particularly for email, was which of the record types was there a risk that it was the only unique copy happened to be in the email archive. It only came through email. And there it became obvious that for the most part, most of the records that were subject to legal and regulatory requirements were not usually in email. It would be, or at least not unique. So, for example, you may have reports that are coming from a database. The information in the database is regulatory required, and they have to keep it amount of time. But the reports that are obviously generated are not the records. It's not the system of records. So one of the things we did is after we looked at the 50 or 60 that had regulatory requirements, then we started looking at and interviewing the subject matter experts to determine whether this was a type, whether there was a risk that the unique information that they needed was actually an email. And there it came down to very few where there was a risk. And I think even the ones where there was a relatively high risk that there could be unique records in the email, it was a small percentage of that record type. But we took the view that those were high risk. So if there was a legal and regulatory requirement associated with it, and there was a high risk that at least some of those records were unique and were in email, based on the witness interviews, we classified those as high risk. And then we also did medium risk. If it was slightly different, it could be a regulatory requirement but not likely to be an email. And then others where it wasn't a regulatory requirement but there was a very high business need for that information, So we went through and risk categorized each of the record types before we even began the process of record categorization training for the tool.
Gotcha. Sounds fairly complex. How do you, at the end of the day, what kind of key performance indicators, would you use to double check all this to make sure that that the classification tool is working?
Well, we did a number of things. So one of the first things we did, once we sort of defined the high risk and medium risk categories, then the next step was developing a knowledge base. And knowledge base development is something that I think you can start thinking about now, even if you're not quite there yet, is figuring out what are basically the exemplars for each of your record categories. So if you look at every record category and you say, okay, I see a record type, maybe it's an HR record, then it's personnel files or something, it's really determining which of those, what are the different record types of personnel files or whatever that you're looking for. So what we did is had a team of people look through all the examples that were listed in the retention schedule of the types of records that were associated with each record type and pulled exemplars. And part of that was when we were doing the interviews with the subject matter experts. We asked them, what are the record types? Some of them forwarded those record types to us. Other times we did searches in email for some of the subject matter experts to try to find exemplars based on search terms and the like when we're trying to come up with something. And we gathered that and got probably somewhere between 200 and 500 examples of each record type on the high-risk categories to start developing the knowledge database. And then we went through a process. Once we had that, we started testing and sort of walked through each of the record types and started testing it to see if it was identifying the records. And so a lot of this is we had, a sample set, and we'd run the tool against that sample set and start developing the knowledge database. And I think one of the things that this tool does, just to keep it in mind, is at this stage, the only thing we're trying to do is have the tool recognize the difference between all the exemplars we put in there. So it's basically trying to identify one record type versus another record type. And it was this constant iterative process where we would see the results, at least initially, saw the record types that weren't performing and had to do additional work to make sure that it was coming up to what we needed. We decided early on, and so one of the things you have to do is how are you measuring yourself? And one of the things that we decided is we wanted to have at least 80% recall on our high-risk records. And that means, in essence, that we were pretty confident that it was correctly identifying a record. And even if it was over-inclusive, we were comfortable that we were getting most of what we needed. And so we started with that as a guidepost. And then we also wanted to have a relatively high level of precision, probably around 60%, which meant that while it wasn't perfect in identifying every record, it was pretty good, so we didn't want to have too much over retention. So that was the basic metrics that we started with, 80% recall, 60% precision for the high-risk matters, and again, kept training the tool. And again, this is just against the exemplars to make sure that it was identifying one record type from another record type. And then once we got to a certain point, if we couldn't use it with the exemplars, we tried other things to help us, including we started using search terms and sort of, putting your finger on the scale, in other words, to sort of help the tool identify certain records. And once we got to that point, again, constant testing, constant sampling, we got to a point that we were comfortable that it was accurately categorizing the record types. Then we tested it against sort of a pure set and saw if it was actually working against a sample set that was pristine. And we had some problems there. Once it happened, we had to go back and keep testing and keep refining the tool. This took quite some time. It wasn't a quick process, but we eventually got to the point where we were happy with where we needed to be.
So it's an interesting point that on the recall, I remember in the early days of technology-assisted review and e-discovery, you'd say, okay, well, what recall are we shooting for? And invariably, the attorney you're talking to might say 100%. So are you saying that through this process that we won't probably get to 100% recall? And what does that mean for this kind of an approach?
Yeah. So I think, again, this goes back to the risks you're willing to take. You're never going to get 100% recall. There's, frankly, nothing you can do to do that. I think over time, as the tool gets better, you may get there eventually. You may get closer. But one of the things to keep in mind is if you had, 1,000 people in a room and they were looking at every email and categorizing it, you'd probably have less recall, meaning that humans make mistakes. They have different views on what a record may be or whether it is a record or not, and different interpretations. This tool is frankly more standardized. It basically takes human input in terms of how they're categorizing the record and learning from it, and then trying to make it consistent across the board. So one of the things to keep in mind, if you're categorizing, again, think about this. We have over 1.5 billion messages that we were doing on the back end for auto classification. The idea that we would get 100% accuracy is just not realistic. However, again, talking with legal, talking with compliance, we walk them through what the risks were. And obviously you have to balance the risk of you're just going to keep everything forever, which was not sustainable, and we have regulatory issues associated with that in terms of making sure we're not keeping, in this case, health records longer than we needed to, but there's also security issues as well. So there's always a balance. And again, I think over time, after we explained to the general counsel as well as the head of compliance the steps that we were taking to mitigate any risk associated with this, they got more and more comfortable. So again, I think as we talked about before, we were not just relying on the auto classification tool. We were also relying, at least on the front end, on the Smart Assist, basically the assistance given to the people who are classifying the records on the front end, the business folks. So it was bootstrapped. So I think in the end, everyone got comfortable that the numbers, the 80% or whatever the number ended up being, was acceptable. It was an acceptable risk. Again, partly because we don't think all the email is unique in terms of even any one record type. We didn't have one record type that was every record is an email. Most of them were other places. So that's a mitigating factor, as well as the fact that an understanding that if we just said, okay, we're going to have 1,000 people look at these records, if we needed it for regulatory purposes, would not be able to find a better percentage. I think that also comes into play.
Gotcha. So we talked through a case study that's, took a good amount of time, some complex technology, got to some really phenomenal results. For those listening who might be looking at, how to get started, what advice might you have for them to get started on kind of, turning the oil tanker, if you will, of an organization that just saves everything to be able to get to understand its data, apply legal holds, and eventually defensible disposal?
A number of things. I think one of the things that you have to start thinking about is there's a number of challenges associated with this. One of which is the idea that the organization is changing the way it's looking at data. And anytime you have big changes like that, it's going to be difficult, and you're going to have issues with people not wanting change. So change management, if you want to call it that way, is a big factor, which is why you need high-level buy-in before you start the process. And I think one of the things that you have to think about is that this is a huge investment of time and effort by the whole organization. You think of it not as a project, but as a program. So you need the resources. So when you're doing things like going through and figuring out how you're going to approach this, you have to get the resources in play. Second, you have to come through with, again, as we did here, a process for identifying what the goal is in terms of your program. Then you need to have the process in place that's defensible, that everyone buys into, and then it's implementation. And you're going to have setbacks along the way, as I talked about this process, even when you're training the tool and finding exemplars and talking to experts. There were some of these record categories that were really difficult, that the tool just was having problems dealing with. And that meant going back to the subject matter experts sometimes 2 or 3 times, getting additional exemplars to make sure they're good, realizing that some of the exemplars, even though that may be a good example of a record type, for whatever reason, the characteristics of that exemplar were throwing the tool off, and understanding that. So one of the things we saw is that the signature line often, or a header or a footer, could sometimes throw off the tool. So you have to do workarounds around that to make the tool work. And then the other thing that we saw was, and one of the challenges we had, is that oftentimes the tool really couldn't distinguish between 2 record categories or record types that were very similar. There was a lot of overlap. So one of the things that we learned and we ended up doing in this case is combining record categories, at least for purposes of the auto classification, because there was no way the tool could distinguish between two record types that were very similar. So one of the things that we ended up thinking about as we developed this was, in the end, what is our goal here? Our goal here is to make sure that if we have a record, that it's kept, and that it's kept for at least as long as it was legally required to be kept. So when we were combining record categories, oftentimes we were combining record categories that had very similar retention periods, and then we ended up, if we were combining them and one was longer than the other, we always went with the longer record category. And what that allowed us to do is, frankly, get a much higher recall rate, because we started combining the categories, and when we combined some of these categories, the recall rate for the combined category was very high, over 90%. And then one of the things that we ended up doing as we went through this and started thinking about it was, in the end, if this is our goal, is that all we really care about is that records that had a legal or regulatory obligation were kept at least as long as it was needed to. We did a further analysis and realized that even where we weren't getting, not high recall, we had over 80% for each category, but even when we were getting like 80% for one of the things we saw was if it wasn't being categorized as a record accurately for that one category, it was being categorized as a record for a category that was at least as long in terms of retention period. So that's where we ended up getting over 90% recall, meaning 90% recall or 90% confident that a record was at least being categorized for at least as long a retention period as we needed it for. So in the end, the ultimate goal of the program, which was, are we meeting our legal and regulatory obligations? The answer was yes. And that made a tremendous difference in terms of defining the success of the program and, frankly, making it more defensible. And again, I think this is we went through this project and developed this program. Every stakeholder sort of started understanding what the goal was and why they should be comfortable with this. And again, I think we talked with even like the head of compliance and giving them cheat sheets to talk to regulators so that they understood. And when they talk to regulators, they can explain how confident they were that they were meeting their goals on their legal and regulatory obligations through this program.
Absolutely. That's a great outcome. Well, it looks like we're right around the end of our time. I wanted to thank Anthony, Diana, Barbara, and the folks at IDG for the webinar. We hope you enjoyed your experience. Thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Thank you to my guests, Jake Frazier and Anthony Diana. For additional information on this topic, please click on the green resources icon on your screen. And thanks for joining us. For IDG, the CGOC, and IBM, I'm Barbara Call.